All right, so get this. Bitcoin influencing how we design buildings.
Yeah.
We're going deep on Bitcoin urbanism today. And I gotta say, I'm intrigued already.
It's a fascinating concept for sure.
Yeah.
And Demeester, he's a big name in the Bitcoin world.
Right.
Wayne makes some pretty bold predictions about how this digital currency, how it could actually reshape our physical world.
So we're not just talking about, buying and selling Bitcoin. This is like a whole different way to think about architecture.
Yeah, it's a whole shift in mindset.
Okay.
Demeester seems pretty sure that Bitcoiners will be the ones that are really driving this change.
Really?
Yeah.
And is that just because he seems to think they're going to have a lot of money to throw around, or is there something else there?
Well, I mean, he does mention that many Bitcoiners are, kind of in that prime home buying stage of life right now.
Right.
But he also argues that it's deeper than just their potential wealth. He sees a real connection between the values a lot of people associate with the Bitcoin community: longevity, efficiency, that decentralization,
right,
and the principles of good architecture.
Okay. I can see where longevity would fit in, right?
Yeah.
Buildings that last, durable.
Exactly.
But I'm not sure I'm following. How does decentralization play into all of this?
Well, think about it. In the Bitcoin world, decentralization, that's about shifting power away from those central authorities, those big institutions, and towards a more distributed network.
Okay, yeah.
Demeester suggests that this idea, it could translate into architectural designs that are less reliant on these centralized systems, more focused on self-sufficiency.
That's interesting. So like buildings that are designed to be off-grid?
Exactly.
Maybe with their own energy sources or water collection?
Yeah. And it's not just individual buildings either.
No.
It's about thinking about communities that are designed with resilience in mind, with self-reliance.
Wow.
He really seems to be envisioning a future where our physical spaces, they kind of reflect that decentralized ethos of Bitcoin,
Wow, he keeps using this term fiat architecture.
Right.
And it seems like he's really drawing a contrast between that and what he calls Bitcoin urbanism.
He is. And it gets to the core of his argument, really.
Okay.
He describes this fiat architecture as a trend, building quickly and cheaply.
Yeah.
Prioritizing those short-term profits over long-term value.
Right.
Think about those mass-produced cookie-cutter designs. They lack character.
Yeah, they definitely don't age well.
No. And they're often unsustainable, too.
Exactly.
So instead of these kind of disposable buildings, he's talking about structures that are designed for permanence, built with quality materials.
Right.
That focus on longevity.
So like some of those beautiful centuries-old buildings you see in Europe.
Exactly.
Built to last, really built to last.
Yeah, and he even references a Vitruvian triad: durability, utility, and beauty as those core principles of both Bitcoin and this more traditional approach to architecture. He sees Bitcoiners really gravitating towards buildings that embody these values, structures that aren't just functional.
Yeah.
But they're aesthetically pleasing and built to withstand the test of time.
But wouldn't building that way be incredibly expensive?
It's a good question.
I mean, isn't that part of the reason why we see so much of this fiat architecture?
Yeah.
That drive to cut costs, maximize profits?
Right. That's a valid point. But Demeester, he argues that Bitcoin, with its decentralized nature and its focus on that long-term value, it could actually disrupt those financial incentives that we see in the construction industry today.
Okay, now you've got me really interested. How so?
Well, he suggests that as Bitcoin gains wider adoption and its value increases, Bitcoiners, they could become a major force in the real estate market.
Okay, so they'd have the money to invest in these more durable, more aesthetically pleasing buildings.
Exactly. Yeah. And because their investment philosophy is rooted in Bitcoin's long-term perspective, they'd be more likely to prioritize quality and longevity over those short-term gains.
Okay, now we're talking about a real paradigm shift.
Yeah.
But let's get specific for a second. What would a Bitcoin-inspired building actually look like?
Yeah.
Would it be all minimalist, concrete, and steel because it's reflecting this digital world?
Not necessarily. Remember, he's emphasizing those core principles, not a specific style.
Right.
He talks a lot about modular design, structures that can be easily adapted and expanded over time.
Interesting. That actually reminds me of some traditional Japanese houses. They often have those sliding walls and flexible spaces that can be reconfigured to suit different needs.
Yeah.
Would that be similar to what he's suggesting?
That's a great comparison, actually.
Hmm.
He specifically mentions a simple house from the 1890s that's evolved over the years,
Oh, wow.
adapting to the needs of the people who live there. And he contrasts that with like a trendy geodesic dome from the 1960s.
Right.
That's pretty much impossible to modify. He sees a parallel between that adaptability in architecture and the Bitcoin network itself constantly being updated, improved.
So it's not about being stuck in the past. It's about combining those time-tested principles with modern technologies.
Exactly. And this is where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
Demeester suggests this Bitcoin urbanism wouldn't just be about individual buildings.
No.
It could extend to entire communities, maybe even cities.
Hold on. So we're talking about building entire cities based on Bitcoin principles.
It's a bold vision.
That's a bold vision.
But he believes that as the Bitcoin community grows, in size and influence, that we could see them driving larger scale projects, like public buildings, designed with these same principles in mind. Imagine libraries, museums designed to stand for centuries as a testament to good design and, of course, Bitcoin.
A museum built to last centuries. Wow, that's incredible. You start to think about the artifacts and ideas that they would preserve in a place like that.
Right.
Would they become repositories of digital history alongside those physical objects?
It's a fascinating question. And it really gets at the heart of what he's suggesting. It's not about just replicating the past.
Yeah.
It's about creating a future where those physical spaces, they reflect our values and aspirations.
So instead of just like preserving the past, these Bitcoin urbanist spaces, they would be about building a bridge to the future.
Yeah, exactly. And that future, as Demeester sees it, it's really rooted in the same principles that underpin Bitcoin.
Okay.
Decentralization, transparency, that long-term thinking.
He actually compares this potential shift in architecture to a historical movement.
Yeah.
The City Beautiful movement, have you heard of that?
Oh, yeah.
It sounds like they were onto something similar, but way back in the late 19th, early 20th century.
It's a really interesting comparison. The City Beautiful movement, they were all about beautification. That grandeur in city planning.
Uh-huh.
They built these grand boulevards, parks, really impressive civic buildings,
Wow.
all intended to inspire civic pride.
Wow. So they believed that beautiful, well-designed spaces could actually have a positive impact on society?
Absolutely. And while their architectural style might not be exactly what Demeester has in mind for Bitcoin urbanism,
Yeah, right.
he sees a shared ethos there.
Okay.
An understanding that the environment we build around us, it can shape our values, our aspirations, even our behavior.
So you think he's suggesting we need a similar kind of movement today, but driven by the principles of Bitcoin?
It's an intriguing thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
He doesn't explicitly call for a movement, I'll say that.
Right.
But he definitely seems to believe that Bitcoiners, with their shared values and their growing influence,
Yeah.
they could really spark a major shift in how we think about and design our cities.
It's certainly a different way of looking at things. Instead of just kind of accepting the status quo of, generic high-rises and sprawling suburbs, Bitcoin urbanism, it's like it challenges us to think about how those physical spaces, how they can actually reflect our deepest values.
Precisely. And it's not just about aesthetics, although Demeester, he definitely sees beauty as an important element.
Okay.
He also talks about the importance of community spaces, places where people can connect with each other, face to face.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially in a world that's becoming, well, let's face it, increasingly digital.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, isolating.
Exactly. He argues that, this reliance we have on technology,
Right.
it's led to a decline in real, genuine human connection. And he sees Bitcoin urbanism as a way to push back against that.
So we're talking about designing spaces that encourage that face-to-face interaction, like those, I don't know if you've ever been, but those vibrant public squares you find in a lot of European cities.
Exactly. Think about those spaces, town squares, community gardens,
Yep.
even just bustling marketplaces.
Yeah.
They naturally bring people together.
They do, yeah.
And Demeester seems to be suggesting that we need to prioritize these types of spaces in our cities if we actually want to create a sense of community and belonging.
Makes you wonder how much our current built environment, how much it shapes our social interactions or lack thereof, right?
It's such a fascinating question, and one that architects and city planners have been thinking about for decades, really.
I bet, yeah.
Demeester's ideas, I think they bring a fresh perspective to the conversation.
Yeah.
He's suggesting that the principles of Bitcoin could offer a new model for designing those spaces,
Okay.
spaces that really do prioritize human connection and well-being.
Okay, so we've got these, I mean, these are grand visions.
Yeah.
Beautiful, durable buildings, vibrant community spaces.
Right.
But let's be real for a second. Isn't this all just a utopian fantasy?
Yeah.
The real world is messy. We've got regulations, building codes, not to mention the existing infrastructure of our cities.
Yeah.
I mean, all of those things, it seems like they would stand in the way of such a radical transformation.
Yeah.
You're right. You know, there are always practical challenges when you're talking about these kinds of big ideas.
Right.
But Demeester does seem to get that it's not going to be an overnight revolution.
Right.
He talks about it as more of like a gradual evolution,
Okay.
starting with those individual projects.
Right.
And then slowly, starting to influence the larger systems.
So less about imposing a rigid blueprint
Yeah.
and more about kind of shifting the conversation.
Exactly. Encouraging people to just think differently about the spaces we live in.
Right.
And even if Bitcoin urbanism doesn't play out exactly as he's envisioning it,
Yeah.
the ideas themselves, they're still really thought-provoking.
It's like planting these seeds of change.
Exactly.
If more architect developers, even policymakers, if they start considering these principles, durability, community, long-term thinking,
Yeah.
that could lead to some really interesting developments. Absolutely. And Demeester, he points out that a lot of Bitcoiners, they're already putting these ideas into practice, in their own way.
Really?
Yeah. He describes it as like a first wave of this Bitcoin-inspired architecture.
Okay.
Where it's individuals and communities, they're building homes and projects that reflect these values.
So we might start to see these principles popping up in those individual projects.
Yeah.
And then maybe they'll gradually influence larger development trends.
Exactly. It's about showing that there are alternatives to that fiat architecture that he's critical of.
Yeah.
And as these new models, as they gain traction, as people see them,
Right.
they might start rethinking their own approaches.
It really makes you wonder, what would a city design with these principles at its core? What would that actually feel like?
Yeah.
Would it have a different energy, a different pace of life?
It's amazing to think about.
Yeah.
Demeester seems to think that a city like that, it would have a much greater sense of community, a deeper connection to place.
Yeah.
And that long-term perspective that seems to be, well, it feels like it's missing sometimes.
Yeah.
In our fast-paced world.
Right. Everything's about the short term these days.
Exactly.
Well, it's a really compelling vision, I gotta say, even if we don't know how it might actually play out in the real world.
Yeah.
But I think you've highlighted something really crucial in this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
It's not really just about the buildings themselves, right?
Yeah.
It's about the ideas, the values.
Exactly.
The things that those physical spaces actually represent.
Exactly. And what Demeester's suggesting is that Bitcoin, with its own unique set of principles,
Right.
that potential to really shake things up,
Yeah.
it could actually inspire us to create a world, physical spaces that are more in line with what we actually need and aspire to.
As we're wrapping up this deep dive, it feels less like we've come to a neat conclusion and more like we've just opened up this whole other world of questions and possibilities.
And that's often the sign of a really good conversation, don't you think?
I think so, yeah.
It's not about those easy answers. It's about challenging how we think about things and really sparking the imagination.
Well said. And, who knows, maybe those sparked imaginations, those will be the ones that design those Bitcoin-inspired cities of the future.
Wouldn't that be something?
It would be incredible. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into Bitcoin urbanism. It's something that I'm going to be thinking about for a while, and I hope our listeners will too. Until next time, keep exploring these ideas, keep questioning, keep imagining those possibilities.